The letter arrived before sunrise. Ilara did not need to open it. She already knew what it said. She had been watching it come for months, carried quietly in the eyes of her husband, in the tight smiles of the pack elders, in the way conversations stopped whenever she walked into a room. The letter was simply the world making official what everyone had already decided. She sat at the edge of the bed and held the folded paper in both hands. Outside, the Ironmore Pack's territory was still dark. Somewhere in the forest beyond the window, a wolf howled once and went silent. Ilara pressed her lips together and opened the letter. It was short. 5 years of marriage, 5 years of trying, 5 years of hoping, and it ended in 4 lines, written in her husband's careful handwriting. Alpha Caden Blackwell informed her that the Pack Council had reviewed her condition. The healers had confirmed their diagnosis. The decision had been made. She was to appear before the full pack gathering at the Harvest Moon ceremony that evening. No other details were given. None were needed. Ilara set the letter down on the wooden table beside the bed and looked at her hands. They were steady. She had expected them to shake. She had imagined this moment many times over the past 2 years, lying awake while Caden slept, staring at the ceiling and running through every possible version of how it might end. She had cried in those quiet hours. She had argued with herself. She had bargained with every hope she had left. But now that the moment had actually arrived, her hands were perfectly still. She stood up and began to dress. The village was already stirring when she stepped outside. Ironmore was a large, well-organized pack settlement, built into the edge of a dense northern forest. The houses were solid and practical, the paths between them worn smooth by generations of feet. Smoke was rising from the bakery. 2 young wolves were hauling water from the well near the gathering hall. A group of older women sat on the steps of the medicine house, talking in low voices. They went quiet when they saw Ilara. They watched her walk by, and then they kept talking, quieter than before. She had grown used to that. The watching, the quiet that followed her. Ilara had come to Ironmore at 19 years old, brought in as the chosen mate of the Alpha's son, through a traditional pairing arranged by her home pack. She had been young and nervous, and desperately eager to do everything right. Caden had been kind to her in those early years. He was tall and dark-haired, and serious in the way that leaders often are, and he had treated her with a respectful warmth that she had mistaken, for a long time, for love. She had loved him. She was almost certain of that, or at least, she had loved the version of him that existed before the pressure started. The pressure had started after the first year. It was gentle at first, his mother asking careful questions, the healer offering teas and supplements with a polite smile. Small comments from the elders about the importance of strong bloodlines for the future of the pack. Ilara had smiled and nodded, and privately told herself it would happen when it was meant to happen. After the 2nd year, the comments were less gentle. After the 3rd year, the healer began running tests. The tests were intrusive and uncomfortable, and Ilara endured them without complaint, because she wanted answers just as much as anyone else. She wanted to know why. She had always imagined herself as a mother. She had thought about it since she was a girl, the kind of quiet, bone-deep wanting that does not announce itself but simply exists as part of you. So she went to every appointment and answered every question and held very still while the healer pressed her hands against Ilara's abdomen and frowned. The diagnosis came at the end of the 3rd year. Barren. The healer used the word without hesitation, the way someone might state the weather. The fertility rituals had failed. The treatments had produced no change. There was, in the healer's professional opinion, no reasonable prospect of children. She wrote the findings in a bound record book and filed it with the Pack Council. And Ilara walked home alone, in the gray afternoon light, and sat on the floor of her kitchen for a very long time without moving. After that, everything changed. Caden changed. He did not become cruel, which almost would have been easier. Cruelty at least has a clear edge. Instead, he became distant. He became polite in the way that strangers are polite, careful and surface level, never quite looking at her directly. He stopped sitting beside her at the evening fire. He stopped reaching for her hand during ceremonies. He started staying late at council meetings, and when he came home, he went straight to sleep without speaking. Ilara lay awake and watched the darkness, and understood, slowly and painfully, that she was being erased from his life, one small gesture at a time. The pack followed his lead, the way packs always do. The women who had been her friends found reasons to be busy. The invitations stopped coming. When she walked through the village, people looked at her with a particular kind of expression that she eventually identified as pity, mixed with distance. The look of people who have already decided that someone's story is over, and do not want to be too close when the ending comes. She tried to hold her head up. That was the only thing she knew how to do. She went to the morning markets and greeted people by name, and asked after their children, and helped the herb keeper sort dried plants on Tuesdays. She did the things a good pack member does, and she did them with a quiet dignity that cost her more than anyone around her seemed to realize. The 5th year was the hardest. By then, even the pretense of normalcy had worn thin. She heard her name spoken in corners. She caught the phrase dead weight once, through an open window. She saw the knowing looks exchanged between the elders when Caden's new advisor, a sharp-faced man named Garrett, began appearing at council dinners with Alpha Vale's daughter on his arm. Seraphine Vale was 22 years old, healthy, and from a powerful bloodline. Everyone in the room knew what her presence meant. Everyone except Elara pretended not to. She went home that night and packed a small bag. Not everything, just the things that were hers alone. The things that had come with her from her home pack, and had nothing to do with Ironmore. A small carved wooden bird her father had given her when she left. A blue wool scarf, a journal with half its pages filled, a photograph, creased and soft at the corners, of her mother laughing in a summer field. She packed the bag and put it under the bed and did not touch it again for 3 months. She was not ready to accept what it meant, but she needed it to be there. On the morning of the harvest moon, she pulled it out. She dressed carefully that day. She wore the deep green dress she had brought from her home, not anything Ironmore had given her. She braided her dark hair back from her face and looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin for a long moment. She was 24 years old. Her face was thinner than it had been when she arrived. Her eyes looked older than she felt. She studied her own reflection, the way you study the face of someone you are about to say goodbye to. She picked up her small bag and set it beside the door. She spent the morning hours sitting in the garden behind the house, where she had planted herbs in her first year. Lavender and sage and rosemary, things that grew slowly and required patience. They had grown well. The garden was the one place in Ironmore that felt entirely hers. She sat among the plants and listened to the bees working in the lavender, and let the morning pass. Caden found her there in the early afternoon. He sat down across from her on the low stone bench, without being invited, and for a while, neither of them spoke. A bee moved between the lavender stalks. Somewhere in the distance, children were shouting happily, in the way children do, the sound light and careless as a thrown ball. "You know what's happening tonight," Caden said. It was not a question. "I received your letter," Elara said. He looked at his hands. "I want you to understand that this was not my choice alone." She looked at him then, fully and directly, the way she had not allowed herself to look at him in months, because looking at him directly had always made the pain sharper. "Whose choice was it?" she asked. He did not answer. "You are the alpha," she said, "or you will be, when your father steps down. Nothing in this pack happens without your decision." The council voted. "And what did you vote?" Another silence. The bee moved away from the lavender and disappeared into the afternoon haze. Caden's jaw tightened. He had the kind of face that was easier to read than he thought, and Elara had spent 5 years learning to read it. "I did what was necessary for the pack," he said. Elara nodded slowly. She had thought this moment would hurt more. She had prepared herself for a particular kind of pain, the sharp, shattering kind. But what she felt instead was something quieter and deeper, the feeling of something clicking finally into its true position, like a door that had been stuck for years finally swinging closed. "Then go do what is necessary," she said. "I will be there tonight." He looked at her, as though he had expected something else. Anger, maybe. Tears. Some kind of scene that would allow him to feel justified. But she offered him nothing, and after a moment, he stood up and left. She listened to his footsteps on the path until they faded, and then she was alone again, with her garden and the afternoon light. She stayed there until the sun began to set. The harvest moon ceremony was held in the open field at the center of the village, where the old stones stood in a circle. Every pack member attended. It was one of the most important ceremonies of the year, a time for blessings and announcements, and the formal recognition of bonds. Elara stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, and felt every eye in the field find her as she arrived. She kept her face calm and her chin level, and walked to her place, as if she had every right to be there, because she did. Caden stood at the center of the stone circle, with the pack elder, a white-haired woman named Barren, who had always looked at Alara with more sadness than coldness. The firelight made their faces glow orange and gold. The rest of the pack stood in a wide ring around them, silent now, the way large groups go silent when something important is about to happen. Barren spoke the ceremonial words. Blessings for the season. Thanks for the harvest. The health of the pack and its future. Standard words that Alara had heard at every harvest moon since she arrived. And then, after the blessings were done, Barren stepped back and Caden stepped forward. He was wearing his best clothes. His dark hair was combed. He looked, objectively, like someone who should be trusted. Alara stood at the edge of the firelight and watched him with clear, quiet eyes. I stand before this pack tonight, Caden said, his voice carrying easily across the field, to make a formal announcement that concerns the future of Ironmore. This is not a decision made lightly, or without great thought, but it is a decision made with the good of the pack at heart. He paused. The fire crackled. No one in the crowd made a sound. I formally sever my mate bond with Alara Voss, he said. The bond is ended. She is released from her place in this pack, and from any claim to rank or standing within Ironmore territory. The words landed in the silence, like stones into still water. Alara felt the bond break. She had not known it would feel like that. She had thought, perhaps, that it would be like something being cut, clean and sharp, but it was not like that. It was like something being pulled out, slowly and completely, from somewhere very deep inside her chest, a warmth she had not known she was still carrying, leaving. She breathed in once, long and careful, and made sure her face did not change. No one moved. A few people looked away. The elder, Barren, stared at the ground. Seraphine Vale stood at the far edge of the ring, half hidden by the crowd, her hands clasped in front of her, and her face perfectly still. You are free to go, Caden said, and he was looking at Alara now, directly, and she could not read his expression at all. She held his gaze for one long moment. Then she turned, picked up the small bag she had set at her feet, and walked out of the stone circle. The crowd parted for her without a word. She walked through the gap and down the path toward the edge of the village. She did not look back. She did not cry until she was past the border stones and into the dark edge of the forest, where no one could see her. Then she stopped walking and stood among the trees and let herself cry, just for a few minutes, quietly, with her hand pressed against her mouth. She allowed herself that, and then she wiped her face with her sleeve, picked up her bag, and kept walking. The night was cold. The moon was enormous. She walked by its light, one foot after the other, away from Ironmore and everything she had spent 5 years trying to become. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she was not stopping. The wildlands began where the pack roads ended. Alara had heard stories about the wildlands since childhood. Every pack child did. The neutral territory between bordered lands was described in those stories as a place of danger and freedom in equal measure. A stretch of untamed forest and frozen river, and open hillside, where no alpha held authority, and no pack law applied. Some people went into the wildlands and disappeared. Some came out changed. A rare few made lives there, solitary and quiet, like animals that had stopped needing company. She had not planned to go to the wildlands. She had been walking with no real direction, moving away from Ironmore rather than toward anything in particular, and the path had narrowed, and then the path had ended, and she had kept walking anyway because stopping had not felt possible. The first day was manageable. She had food in her bag, dried fruit and hard bread that she had quietly set aside over the previous weeks without examining the reason too closely. She had a small knife, a fire-starting kit, a wool blanket. She had her blue scarf. She walked until her legs ached, and then she found the sheltered side of a large rock and spent the night curled beneath the blanket, with her back against the stone. She did not sleep much. The cold was sharper than she had prepared for, and the sounds of the wildlands at night were nothing like the sounds of a pack settlement, less settled, more alive, pressing in from all directions. The second day was harder. She crossed a wide, shallow stream and soaked her boots, and her feet stayed cold for the rest of the day. She finished the last of the dried fruit. The bread was almost gone. She found some berries she recognized from her herb-keeping work and ate those carefully, and she boiled water from a small creek over a tiny fire, that she built with hands that had started to shake. She told herself the shaking was from cold, not fear. The third day, she fell. It was stupid. A patch of ice on a slope she had not looked at carefully enough. One moment she was walking, the next she was sliding, and then falling, and then hitting the bank of a frozen river hard enough to knock the air completely from her chest. She lay there on the riverbank with her face against the snow, and waited for the world to stop spinning. When it did, she tried to sit up and found that her left ankle protested strongly. Not broken, she thought, but twisted badly enough to matter. She managed to drag herself to the base of a large tree and lean against it. She assessed what she had: half a piece of bread, a blanket, a fire kit with damp wood she had not been careful enough to keep dry, a knife she was not sure she had the strength to use effectively, an ankle that would not take her weight, and the temperature dropping as the afternoon light began to fade. She built the fire with difficulty, her cold fingers slow and clumsy. It took 4 attempts to get a spark to catch, and when the flame finally appeared, she leaned over it with something close to gratitude. She fed it small pieces of dry bark she found under the tree's root shelf and watched it grow, and told herself that someone would come along, that someone would see the smoke, that things did not end like this, quietly and stupidly on the bank of a frozen river because of a patch of ice. She was not entirely sure she believed that. She was sitting with her back against the tree, the fire burning low in front of her, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, when she heard footsteps. Slow and steady footsteps, moving through the snow without any particular urgency. She reached for her knife, which was more instinct than any real plan. The man who came out of the trees was tall, very tall. He wore a dark traveling coat that was dusted with snow at the shoulders, and he moved with the kind of stillness that people develop when they have spent a long time alone and have stopped performing ease for anyone else. His hair was dark and cut short, and his face was angular, with the look of someone who had been out in all kinds of weather for a long time. His eyes, when he saw her and stopped walking, were the color of moonlight on water. Silver, a very unusual color. He looked at her fire, at her ankle, at her face. He did not speak right away. She did not lower the knife. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that does not feel the need to convince anyone of anything. "I do not know that," she said. "That is fair," he said. He set down the large pack he was carrying, and crouched a few feet from her, at a distance that was clearly chosen to be not threatening, and he looked at her ankle. "That looks like it hurts." "It does," she said. "You cannot walk on it tonight." "I know." He looked around at the fading light, at the temperature that was visibly dropping, at her small fire. He seemed to be doing a quiet calculation. "There is a cabin half a mile from here," he said. "I have been using it for the past week. There is a proper fire, food, and a roof. I am offering to take you there, and you are allowed to say no." Elara studied him. She was 24 years old, and cold and hurt, and had not eaten a real meal in 3 days, and she was in the middle of the wildlands with a blanket and a failing fire. She was not naive. She understood that accepting help from a stranger carried risk. She also understood that refusing it, in her current situation, carried a near certainty of not surviving the night. "If you try to harm me," she said, "I will use this knife." "I believe you," he said. He did not smile when he said it. He just looked at her steadily, those unusual silver eyes calm and direct. She put the knife in her pocket. He helped her to her feet with a steadiness that was careful and impersonal, and he adjusted her weight so that she could lean against him without putting pressure on her ankle. And they walked, slowly, through the darkening trees. He did not talk during the walk, which she appreciated. Talking would have required something from her that she did not have available. The cabin was exactly what he had said: small, solid, made from dark timber, with a stone chimney already breathing smoke into the night sky. Inside it was simple. A main room with a fire, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed against one wall, and a sleeping mat rolled up near the hearth. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams. A kettle sat on the stone ledge above the fire. He helped her to a chair, and crouched to look at her ankle. His examination was careful and thorough, the kind of examination that suggested he had done this sort of thing before. "Not broken," he said. "Badly twisted. You need to keep your weight off it for at least 3 days." 3 days, she repeated. "Minimum." He moved to the kettle and began heating water. She looked around the cabin. It was a lived-in space, but there was almost nothing personal in it. No photographs, no decorations. A few books stacked on a shelf, worn and unmarked. A single travel bag, military in its neatness, set against the far wall. Whoever this man was, he traveled light and left no traces. "What is your name?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, his back to her, stirring something into the hot water. Then he said, "You can call me Kale." It was not quite an answer, she noticed that, but she was too tired to push it, so she accepted it. He gave her food, hot broth first, then bread and dried meat. He did not make conversation while she ate, which was another thing she appreciated. He sat in the second chair and read one of his books and let her eat in peace. Outside, the wind had picked up and was pressing against the window. The fire cracked and shifted. The herbs on the ceiling beams swayed gently. She finished eating and felt the warmth move through her like a slow tide, and for the first time since the harvest moon ceremony, she felt the tension in her shoulders ease, just slightly, just enough. "Thank you," she said. He looked up from his book. "You are welcome." "I am Ilara," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those silver eyes that were impossible to read, and something passed across his face too briefly for her to name it. "I know it is not my business," he said carefully, "but you did not end up on a frozen riverbank by accident. If there is someone following you, I should know." "No one is following me," she said. "I was cast out. I am just trying to find somewhere to go." He was quiet. Then he said, "That takes time. Stay until your ankle heals." She nodded. She had intended to stay 3 days. She stayed 12. The days settled into a simple rhythm. Kale was gone for several hours each morning. He never said where he went or why, and she did not ask. He returned by midday and spent the afternoons doing small practical tasks, checking the cabin's structure, maintaining equipment, preparing food. He was competent at everything, with the efficiency of someone who had been entirely self-reliant for a long time. They began to talk. Not immediately, and not about anything large at first. She told him about the herbs hanging from the beams, which ones were which, what they were used for. He listened with real interest. He told her, briefly, about the wildlands terrain, which routes were safer, which rivers flooded in the spring. She told him about her garden at Ironmore, the lavender and the sage, the way the bees had come every summer. His face changed slightly when she mentioned Ironmore, something careful behind his eyes, but he did not comment. On the 6th day, she told him what had happened. Not because he asked. He did not ask. But she was sitting across the fire from him in the evening, and the words were there, and she was tired of carrying them alone. She told him about the marriage, and the years of trying, and the healer's diagnosis, and the slow way she had been made to feel that she was worth less and less, until she was worth nothing. She told him about the ceremony, the bond breaking, the walk through the dark forest. She did not cry while she told it. She had already cried what she had to cry. Kale listened without speaking. He did not offer sympathy in the easy, performed way that people sometimes do. He sat very still and listened, and when she was done, he said, "You are worth considerably more than they allowed you to believe." She looked at him. "That is simply accurate," he said, looking back at her without any excess of expression. "I am not saying it to be kind." Something in her chest, something that had been wound tightly for 5 years, loosened a fraction more. On the 9th day, her ankle was well enough to walk on carefully. She knew she could leave. She chose not to, and she examined that choice honestly, sitting alone in the morning while Kale was on his walk. She stayed because the cabin was the first place in years where she felt entirely herself. No one in this cabin looked at her with pity. No one assessed her worth. There was simply 2 people, and a fire, and the clean, cold air of the wildlands outside, and it was quiet, in a way that felt like kindness. She told herself it was only that. She told herself it was rest, and she almost believed it. On the 11th evening, they sat together outside on the wooden step as the sun went down behind the tree line, turning the sky above the wildlands a deep, cold orange. She had wrapped her blue scarf around her shoulders. He was leaning with his elbows on his knees, looking at the tree line. They had been talking about something ordinary, the migratory birds she had been watching from the window, but the conversation had run into a comfortable silence. She looked at his profile in the fading light, the strong line of his jaw, the unusual silver of his eyes now catching the last of the sunset. she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she did not know anything about this man, not really. She knew how he moved through a room, careful and exact. She knew that he slept lightly and was awake before her every morning. She knew that he never spoke about himself, but listened with complete attention when she spoke. She knew that he was the first person in a very long time who had made her feel like she was visible again. She did not say any of that. She just said, "Where do you go in the mornings?" He turned to look at her. In the orange light, his expression was warmer than usual. "That is a long answer," he said. "I have time," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When I leave here, I will explain it. I promise you that." She accepted that. She was not sure why she did. She simply did. On the 12th morning, she woke to find him gone. Not on his usual morning walk. Gone. The mat by the fire was rolled neatly. His travel bag was not by the wall. A single piece of paper was folded on the table, and on it, written in a precise, careful hand, was the direction to the nearest border town, the name of an honest innkeeper who would give her work and lodging, and the words, "You are not forgotten." No signature. She stood in the empty cabin for a long time, holding the paper. The fire had been built up before he left, still burning warm. The kettle was on the stone shelf, already hot. He had made sure she would wake up warm. He had made sure she would wake up to a direction and a plan. He had thought about her comfort even in his leaving. She sat down at the table and pressed her fingers against the words he had written. Her throat was tight. She was not going to cry. She was not going to cry over a man who had been kind to her for 12 days in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket and drank the tea that was still warm in the kettle. Then she picked up her bag, the small one she had left Ironmore with, the blue scarf around her neck, and she followed the direction he had written down, toward the border town, toward whatever came next. She did not know, walking out through the snow in the early morning, that everything she believed about herself was about to be rewritten. She did not know that the 12 days in that cabin had already changed the direction of her entire life. She did not know the name that the rest of the world used for the silver-eyed man who had simply called himself Cale. She only knew that she felt, for the first time in a long time, like she was walking towards something rather than away. The town of Ashvale sat at the edge of the neutral territories, close enough to the western pack borders to trade freely, but far enough from any Alpha's seat to be left alone. It was not a beautiful town. The buildings were gray stone and practical timber, the streets narrow and unevenly paved, the market stalls modest and sensible. But it was honest in the way that frontier places often are, not performing anything, not pretending to be more than it was. People in Ashvale went about their business with their heads down, and did not ask unnecessary questions of strangers, who came in from the wildlands with worn boots and a small bag. Ilara arrived in the early afternoon of the third day after leaving the cabin. She found the inn that Cale had written down, a low building called the Hearthstone, run by a stout, broad-shouldered woman named Olive, who had white hair cut short, and a permanent expression of practical assessment. She looked Ilara over once when she walked through the door, took in the worn coat, the clean face, the quiet eyes, and said, "He sent you then." Ilara did not ask who she meant. "He wrote me a direction," she said. Olive nodded once, as if that confirmed something. "I have a room at the back. Small but dry, and I need someone who knows herbs. My last assistant left with a trader in the spring, and I have not replaced her. She named a wage that was modest but fair. You can earn your keep and save enough to move on if you want to. Or you can stay. No one will ask you your history here." "Thank you," Ilara said. "Do not thank me," Olive said. "Work is its own thanks." She worked. She was good at it, which helped. Her years of helping the herb keeper in Ironmore had given her a solid working knowledge, and Olive ran a small dispensary out of the back of the inn, providing remedies to the townspeople and the occasional traveler. Ilara organized the stock, learned Olive's methods quickly, and within 2 weeks was handling most of the preparation work herself. It was simple, steady, useful work, and it turned out that simple, steady, and useful were exactly what she needed. Ashvale's people warmed to her slowly, the way careful people do. A woman named Clara, who ran the weaving stall, began stopping by the dispensary to chat. The miller's wife started asking for Ilara, specifically when she came for her remedies, saying that Ilara had a patient way of explaining things that made her feel less worried. A group of older men who played cards outside the cobbler's shop in the evenings began nodding at her when she passed, which in Ashvale counted as genuine warmth. She thought about Cale less than she expected to, and more than she admitted. She told herself he was a stranger she had met for 2 weeks. She told herself the gratitude she felt was just that, gratitude, amplified by the circumstances. She told herself that people in difficult situations sometimes attached significance to whoever happened to be kind to them, and that was a normal response, not an informative one. She believed some of this. But some mornings, stirring herbs over the small dispensary stove, she would find herself thinking about his voice, the way it was even and low, and not performing any emotion it did not genuinely contain. Or his eyes, that unsettling silver, direct and steady, or the words he had written on the paper she still carried in her coat pocket, "You are not forgotten." She was 6 weeks into her time in Ashvale when she began to feel unwell. It started as fatigue. She was tired in a way that did not match her sleep, a heavy, pulling tiredness that made the mornings difficult. Then there was a persistent nausea in the early hours that faded by midday. She assumed she had caught something, a traveling illness, common enough in towns like Ashvale where people came and went. She drank her own remedies and told herself it would pass. It did not pass. After 4 weeks of this, Olive looked at her one morning over the dispensary counter, with the look of someone who has already arrived at a conclusion. "When did you last eat a full meal without feeling sick?" she asked. Elara thought about it. 3 weeks ago, maybe. Olive nodded slowly. "Sit down," she said. She asked careful, specific questions, the kind that an experienced woman asks when she already knows the shape of an answer and is merely confirming the details. Elara answered each one honestly, her hand still on the counter, her mind beginning to move toward something it was not yet willing to reach all the way. When Olive finished her questions, she sat back and looked at Elara with a calm, direct expression. "I am not a healer," she said, "but I have been running a dispensary in a border town for 30 years, and I have sat with many women in this chair. You should go see old Petra on the hill." Petra was Ashvale's healer. She was older than anyone seemed to know, small and quiet, with hands that moved with extraordinary precision. She lived at the top of a steep path on the eastern side of the town, in a stone house surrounded by a garden that was better stocked than anything Elara had seen even in Ironmore. She received Elara without any fuss, seated her by the window, and conducted an examination that was thorough and unhurried. When she was done, she sat across from Elara and clasped her hands in her lap and looked at her steadily. "You are pregnant," she said. Elara heard the words. She sat with them for a moment. Her first response was not what she would have expected. It was not joy, not shock, not disbelief. It was something quieter and stranger, a deep, spreading stillness, as if the whole world had taken one long breath and held it. "That is not possible," she said, and her voice was very calm. "I was diagnosed as Barren, 3 years ago, by the Ironmore pack healers." Petra looked at her without changing expression. "I cannot speak to what another healer told you," she said. "I can only tell you what is true right now, sitting in front of me. You are pregnant." She paused. "And I need to prepare you for something." Elara looked at her. "It is not one," Petra said. "It is two." The stillness broke. Elara sat in the chair by Petra's window and felt the world reorganize itself around her, completely and entirely. Two lives, growing quietly inside her, while she had been walking through snow, and eating dried berries, and boiling river water, and telling herself she was starting over with nothing. 2 lives that the Ironmore healers had declared impossible, that the pack elders had cited as proof of her inadequacy, that had been the reason written on the letter that ended her marriage and cast her out into the wildlands. She pressed both hands flat against her stomach. Her hands were shaking. "This cannot be right," she said, but she did not mean it as a challenge to Petra. She meant it as a statement of how impossible it felt. "It is right," Petra said, gently. Elara sat there with her hands on her stomach and her eyes fixed on the window and the garden beyond it, the carefully tended plants moving softly in the breeze, and she tried to hold all of it at once. The truth of what Petra had just told her, and the enormous destabilizing implication beneath it. If she was pregnant now, then she had never been barren. The healer in Ironmore had been wrong, completely wrong. Or, as a thought moved through her mind like a cold current, perhaps not wrong at all. She thought about the timing. She thought about Caden's swift remarriage plans. She thought about Seraphine Vale appearing on the arm of his advisor, already positioned and ready, as if the ending of Alara's marriage had been scheduled in advance. She thought about the healer's manner, his certainty, the way he had produced the diagnosis almost too quickly, as if he had already written it before she walked into the room. She breathed in slowly. She was not going to reach conclusions she could not support. She was going to stay steady. "How far along?" she asked. Petra told her. The calculation was immediate. The wildlands, the cabin, the 12 days. The silver-eyed stranger who had called himself Kale. She looked down at her hands on her stomach and thought about the paper still in her pocket. "You are not forgotten." She thought about his face in the firelight on that last evening, turned toward her, warmer than usual. She thought about the things she had not let herself think about when they were at the cabin, because it had seemed too fragile to hold. And then she thought about who he was. She thought about his manner, the way he moved through the world, as if nothing in it could touch him without his permission. The way the wildlands themselves seemed to part around him. The way he had known Olive, who ran a quiet inn in a border town, without any explanation offered. She thought about his eyes, the silver of them, a color she had always associated with old stories, with bloodlines so far back they were almost myth. The ruling lineage, the eyes of the Dawnborn house, the Alpha King's eyes. She pressed her hands against her stomach and sat very still and let the truth arrange itself slowly and completely in front of her. Then she closed her eyes, breathed once, opened them. "I will need guidance," she said quietly, to Petra, on what to eat, what to avoid, and how to keep them both healthy. Petra studied her face. Whatever she saw there, she accepted it. "Sit," she said. "We will go through everything." Alara sat. She listened to every word. She asked careful questions and noted the answers. She was going to need all of it. She was carrying the children of the Alpha King, and she was going to do it in a border town in the neutral territories, with no pack behind her, and no name that meant anything here, and she was going to do it correctly. She put her hands in her lap and made herself calm and thought, with a clarity that felt like the strongest thing she had ever felt, that no one was going to touch these children, not the people who had called her Barren, not the pack that had cast her out, not anyone. She thought of Kale's voice, low and even, not performing anything it did not genuinely contain. She thought of the 12 days in that cabin, and what had grown there quietly between them in the firelight, and she pressed that knowledge to her chest, like the carved wooden bird her father had given her, like the blue wool scarf, like all the small things she had carried out of Ironmore. And then she stood up, thanked Petra, and walked back down the hill into the town that had become her home. She had 2 people to prepare for now. She was not going to fail them. Labor came on a night when the sky above Ashvale was completely clear, and so full of stars that it looked unreal, like a painting of a sky rather than an actual one. Alara had been watching it from the dispensary window when the first pain arrived, sudden and certain, and she had gripped the windowsill and breathed and thought, with unusual calm, that it was time. Olive was beside her within 3 minutes, moving with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had prepared for this. Petra was sent for. A fire was built high. The small room at the back of the inn, which Alara had decorated over the previous months with dried flowers and the herbs she found most calming, became the center of a very quiet, very determined event. Alara had prepared for pain. She had read everything Petra had given her. She had talked to Clara from the weaving stall, who had 3 children, and spoke about birth with the matter-of-fact honesty of someone who believed that honesty was more useful than reassurance. She had asked Petra direct questions and received direct answers. She was not going to pretend it was easy. It was not easy. It was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life, and she did not minimize that even to herself. But she was also not alone. That was the part she had not entirely anticipated. Olive's steady presence in the room, Petra's practiced hands and quiet instructions, Clara, who arrived at some point in the middle of it all, and sat by the wall and simply said, "At the right moment, you are doing fine, Alara. Just breathe." The unexpectedness of having people there, that was what she had not expected. The boy came first. He was small and red-faced, and absolutely furious about being in the world, and when Petra laid him on Alara's chest, he stopped crying almost immediately, as if deciding, on reflection, that the arrangement was acceptable. Alara looked at his face and felt something open inside her that she had no word for. Then Petra said, "Again, Alara, the second one." She breathed. The girl came quietly, which was immediately characteristic. No screaming, just a brief complaint, and then she blinked at the room with an expression of grave, unimpressed curiosity that made Clara laugh out loud. She was smaller than her brother, and darker, with hair that stuck up in soft, determined tufts. Petra placed them both on Alara's chest. Two warm, entirely real, entirely actual people, breathing steadily, smelling of new life. Alara looked at them. They looked back at her. And then both of them opened their eyes fully, really opened them, for the first time, and the room went silent. Silver. Both pairs of eyes, the precise clear silver, that was not a common color in any pack or any lineage, the color that appeared in old texts and genealogy records, next to one family name and no other. The color of the dawn-born ruling house. Petra set her instruments down carefully and said nothing. Olive, standing near the door, went very still. Clara, by the wall, stopped laughing and put her hand over her mouth. Alara looked at her children. She looked at their eyes, and she thought of the moment in Petra's house when the truth had arranged itself in front of her, and she thought of a cabin in the wildlands, and a man who moved like the world owed him nothing, but who had treated her as if she mattered. She held her babies tighter. "Their names," Olive said, quietly, because the room needed someone to say something practical. "Have you chosen them?" "Soren," Alara said, looking at the boy. "And Lyra," she said, looking at the girl. Soren and Lyra. They turned their silver eyes toward her voice, and she felt the whole weight of what she had become in this moment. Not just their mother, which would have been enough, but their protection, their ground, their entire world. Everything they needed was going to have to come from her. She had never felt more frightened. She had never felt more certain. The days that followed were the fullest she had ever known. Fullness of a kind she had never experienced before, not the social fullness of pack life, which had always felt slightly like a performance, but the utterly real fullness of two small people who needed her constantly, specifically, and without apology. Soren needed to eat every 2 hours with a focus that was almost aggressive. Lyra needed to be held in a particular way, her head supported at a precise angle, or she communicated her displeasure with impressive volume for someone so small. Alara learned them. Every preference, every signal, every tiny shift in expression that meant something different. She learned which sounds meant hunger, and which meant discomfort, and which were simply commentary on the general situation. She learned to sleep in pieces, to wake instantly and completely, to function on less rest than she would have thought possible. She learned that it was possible to be exhausted and joyful simultaneously, in proportions that shifted by the hour. Olive helped, in her practical and unsentimental way. Clara came by most afternoons and held Lyra, while Alara ate a real meal. Petra checked on them weekly, examining the twins with careful attention, and reporting, each time, that they were developing well and healthily. The town of Ashvale, which had accepted Alara as a quiet stranger and then as a useful worker, now adjusted itself again, to include 2 small silver-eyed children, who were carried through the market in a cloth wrap, one on each side, while their mother picked out vegetables and traded remedies for honey. People noticed the eyes. Of course they did. In a border town full of travelers and traders, unusual physical features were not rare, and most people simply noted the silver color as striking and moved on. But Petra, who was older than anyone knew and had seen more of the world than she discussed, watched the children with a specific, knowing expression. And Olive, who had known Cale by some name that Alara had not pressed her on, and who ran a border inn where certain people sometimes passed through quietly, sometimes looked at the twins with an expression that was less surprise and more a careful, waiting attention. Nobody said anything. Alara did not ask anyone to stay quiet. She simply lived her life and raised her children, and let the months pass. Soren grew faster than his sister, and crawled early, with a single-minded determination that resulted in him reaching places that should not have been reachable. Lyra was slower to move but faster to observe, and from very young she had the habit of watching people and objects with an intensity that was, as Clara said, a bit unnerving in a baby. They were very different from each other, and clearly, unmistakably, a unit. When they were separated for more than a short time, they became quietly distressed, in a way that was not dramatic, but was completely consistent and resolved the moment they were back in proximity. Ilara watched them become people, real, distinct, particular people, not just her children but Soren and Lyra, with preferences and personalities that were already discernible and strengthening. She did not let herself think too often about what their silver eyes meant for the future. She thought about it sometimes, late at night when they were both asleep and the room was very quiet. She thought about the question of Kale, the Alpha King, and what his existence meant for her children's lives. Whether he knew, whether he was looking, whether the paper he had left her, "You are not forgotten," was a personal thing, or a diplomatic thing, or something she had assigned too much meaning to, in a moment of vulnerability. She thought about the healer in Ironmore. She thought about the false diagnosis. She thought about the way the timing had worked, the swiftness of Caden's plans, the readiness of Seraphine Vale. She had never spoken to anyone about this. She had no proof. But the suspicion sat in her, quiet and persistent, and she did not dismiss it. She thought about what she would do when her children were old enough to ask about their father. She had no adequate answer yet. She thought about what would happen if the outside world, the pack world, with its politics and alliances and bloodline obsessions, found its way to Ashvale and to her door. She did not have answers for those thoughts either. What she had was today. A clean room and a warm fire. Two small people who looked at her as if she were the most important thing in the world, which was an experience so entirely different from the 5 years in Ironmore that she sometimes had to sit quietly with it and remind herself that it was real. She had her garden, small but growing, in the yard behind the inn. She had Olive's dispensary and Petra's monthly visits and Clara's afternoon company. She had learned the names of the birds that came to the eastern window in the morning, and the particular way the light fell on the market street at late afternoon, and the sound of Ashvale at night, the creek that ran behind the north row of houses, the distant wolf call from the hills, and always, the fire in the hearth. She had built something here, not the life she had imagined when she was 19, and arriving in Ironmore full of hope. Not the life she might have imagined in the 12 days in a wildlands cabin, with a man she still thought about more than she admitted. A different life. A life that was entirely hers. She sat in the evenings with one twin on each side, Soren leaning against her left arm, and already trying to reach for the nearest object, Lyra simply watching the fire with her serious silver eyes, and she felt the fullness again. The word she had no name for, the thing that made every hard day, every sleepless night, every moment of uncertainty, a price she would pay again, without question. She was their mother. She was their ground. Whatever came next, she was ready. And somewhere, she felt certain without evidence, and without explanation, Cale Dawnborn was following a trail that led toward her. She did not know how she knew. She simply did. She pulled her blue scarf tighter, and watched the fire, and let her children sleep. 3 years is long enough for a world to change. Ilara knew this from the inside. 3 years ago, she had been a cast-out Omega walking through the wildlands with a twisted ankle and a bag that weighed less than her grief. Now she rose each morning before her children woke, moved through the dispensary to set the kettle on, and was often halfway through her morning preparations before 2 small pairs of silver eyes appeared in the doorway, one dramatically above the other, Soren always first, already in motion, Lyra always a step behind, already watching everything. They were 3 years old, and fully, completely themselves. Soren was loud and fast, and interested in everything at once, with a particular obsession with anything mechanical. He had dismantled the latch on the back gate twice, and reassembled it incorrectly both times, which Ilara considered educational, and Olive considered a security issue. He asked questions constantly, rapid fire, often before the previous answer was finished, and he laughed easily and often. A bright, full laugh that people on the street stopped to look at. He had Cale's height already, even at 3, and the same quality of forward momentum, the impression that he was always heading somewhere with a clear objective. Lyra was the one who made people pause. She was quieter than her brother, but not withdrawn. She was precise. She watched situations for a moment before entering them, assessed people with those steady silver eyes, and then engaged with a directness that was sometimes startling in a child her size. She had a memory that Ilara found both impressive and occasionally inconvenient. She also had her mother's hands, the same shape of finger and nail, and a habit of pressing both palms flat on surfaces she found interesting, as if reading them by touch. They were, between them, the complete center of everything. Alara had settled into the life of Ashvale so fully that she sometimes had to remind herself she had arrived there as a stranger with nothing. She had, over 3 years, become a known person here. Not a prominent one, she did not seek prominence, but she was the woman from the dispensary, the one who always knew which remedy to give, the one whose children had silver eyes and excellent manners, the one who grew the best lavender in the eastern quarter. People stopped her in the market to ask questions and trusted the answers. Children came to the dispensary door on healing days with their parents, and Soren and Lyra would appear from wherever they had been and immediately adopt them as temporary companions, which generally made the healing visits go more smoothly. She was not happy in the way she had once imagined happiness would feel, large and warm and obvious. She was happy in the way that a well-made thing is good, because it was built correctly and did what it was meant to do, and when she held it up to the light, it held. But the world outside Ashvale was not standing still. She heard things through the market, through travelers who stopped at the hearthstone, through Olive who listened to everything and said what was relevant without editorializing. The pieces arrived separately, over months, and Alara assembled them quietly. The first thing she heard was that the Alpha King had not taken a formal mate in years, despite considerable pressure from the pack lords. There were rumors about a search, vague and undefined, described by different people in different ways. A personal matter, a succession matter, something the king was pursuing himself, without advisors. She kept her face even when she heard these things and filed them away. The second thing she heard was about Ironmore. Caden's rule had not gone well. She had not wished that, specifically. She had tried not to wish anything about Ironmore at all, because wishing about it required thinking about it, and thinking about it was corrosive. But the news arrived anyway, carried in by a trader who had come through the northern territories. Seraphine Vale had not produced heirs. The Ironmore Council was fracturing under disagreements about succession. Caden was struggling to hold the pack together. His authority was weakening. Alara listened and said nothing, and poured the trader another cup of tea. The third piece of news was the one that changed the quality of the air in the room when Olive told her. The old healer who had declared Alara Barren, a man named Drew, had died the previous winter. He had been old and the winter had been hard, and no one had thought much of it. But among his belongings, found by the new healer who was clearing the medicine house records, was a locked correspondence box. The new healer, being a thorough young woman with a strong sense of professional obligation, had opened it. The letters inside were between Drew and a man whose name Alara recognized instantly. Alpha Vale, Seraphine's father. The letters were several years old. They were careful and coded, but not careful enough, because the new healer had been well trained and had understood what she was reading. The letters outlined an arrangement, a diagnosis to be given, a conclusion to be reached, a sum of currency to be paid, in exchange for a false declaration that would clear the way for a different mating arrangement with more strategic benefit to both parties. The new healer had taken the letters to the pack record keeper. The record keeper had passed them upward. Alara sat across from Olive after hearing this, and looked at the surface of the table for a very long time. "I was never barren," she said, and she already knew this, had known it for 3 years, from the moment Petra had pressed her hands against her abdomen, and said, "It is 2. But hearing the proof aloud, the actual mechanism of it, the names attached to the arrangement, felt different. It felt like being able to stand up after a very long time of being pressed down. "It seems not," Olive said carefully. "They paid him to lie." "It appears so." Alara said nothing for a while. Her hands were flat on the table. She thought of the ceremony. She thought of Caden's voice reading those formal words. She thought of the bond breaking, that pulling out feeling, the worst physical pain she had experienced up to that point in her life. She thought about the night she had walked into the wildlands with a small bag and an injured ankle and nothing else. She thought about Soren and Lyra, asleep in the back room. She thought about their silver eyes. She thought about everything that had grown from the wreckage of that false diagnosis, including the 2 most important people she had ever known. "Is this information public?" she asked. "It is in Ironmore's records," Olive said. "And it is spreading. These things do." Alara nodded. She stood up and went to check on her children. They were asleep in the way small children sleep, completely and without reservation. Soren on his back with his arms thrown wide. Lyra curled on her side with her hands tucked under her cheek. She watched them for a while in the doorway. She had been angry before. In the early days in Ashvale, there had been a heat in her that she had carefully contained, directed into work and routine, and the practical business of survival. It had cooled over time, not because she had forgiven what was done to her, but because the anger had been less useful than the forward motion. But standing in the doorway looking at her 3-year-old twins, knowing now that they existed specifically because someone had paid to destroy her marriage with a lie, she felt something that was not exactly anger. It was cleaner and colder than anger. It was the particular feeling of someone who has been proven right after being told, repeatedly and loudly, that they were wrong. She had not been broken. They had tried to break her, and she had not broken. She thought about Cale. She thought about him more than she thought about Ironmore, which told her something about where her heart actually lived. She thought about the royal search she had been hearing about in fragments. She thought about what it would mean if that search were for her, for them. She was not afraid of it. She found, examining herself honestly, that she was not afraid at all. She had been afraid before, in the early days when she had not yet known how to survive on her own, but she knew now. She had learned it thoroughly. And her children were healthy and strong, and had silver eyes that they had inherited from their father, and there was nothing in the world that was going to determine their futures, except her choices and their own. She went back to the main room. Olive was still at the table. The evening fire was burning in the hearth. Outside, Ashvale was settling into its familiar nighttime sounds. If someone came looking, Ilara said, for them, how would they find us? Olive looked at her without surprise, which meant she had been waiting for this question for some time. The Silver Eyes are known, she said simply. There are not many reports of them, but in a border town, people talk, and if someone were looking carefully and widely enough, Ashvale would come up. Ilara sat down. She thought for a while. I am not going to hide, she said at last. No, Olive agreed, you are not. And I am not going to go running toward anyone either. If anyone comes here, it will be because they did the work of finding us. And when they get here, they will find us exactly as we are. Olive looked at her steadily. There was something in the older woman's expression that might have been, quietly, pride. That seems right, she said. Ilara nodded. She went to the window and looked out at the narrow street of Ashvale, the lamplight on the wet stones, the darkness of the sky beyond the rooftops. Somewhere far from here, the world was moving. Things were being found. Records were being read. A man with silver eyes was following something. She turned back to the room. I need to teach Soren and Lyra about their history, she said. Not all of it, not yet. But some of it. Where they come from, what they are. That is a big conversation for 3-year-olds, Olive said. Then I will start small and build it, Ilara said. They deserve to know who they are. All of it. Even the parts I am still figuring out. She went to bed that night with her mind quieter than it had been in a long time. Not because the uncertainty had resolved. It had not. But because she had decided how she was going to stand in it, and decision had a weight that uncertainty did not. She could put her feet on the ground of a decision, and feel it hold. She slept deeply, and woke before the children, as usual, and stood in the kitchen, with her tea in both hands, and watched the early morning light come through the eastern window, and thought about what was coming, with something close to readiness. She did not know the exact shape of it. She did not need to. She had not known the exact shape of anything for 3 years, and she had managed. She would manage this too. And in the distance, though she could not see them, things were already in motion. Scouts moved through pack territories asking quiet questions. Records were being examined in places Ilara had never visited. A letter was being written, by a careful hand she would recognize, sealed with a crest she had never seen, but would know the moment she saw it. She did not know any of this yet. She just made her tea, and waited for her children to wake up, and faced the morning. The scouts came on a gray morning, when the streets of Ashvale were still damp from an overnight rain. There were 3 of them. They were dressed in plain traveling clothes, which was clearly intentional. Anyone who looked carefully could see the quality of the fabric, the precisely made boots, the controlled way they moved through a space. Nothing wasted, nothing uncertain. They were not ordinary travelers, but they were not advertising what they were either. They stopped at the hearthstone first, which was where everyone stopped in Ashvale. Olive gave them rooms and breakfast, and asked no questions, which was her custom, but she listened, as she always did. and what she heard was that they were asking in the market, quietly and specifically, about silver-eyed children, not making a scene of it, just asking, as if it were a simple, curious question from travelers who had heard something interesting in a previous town. She came to find Alara in the dispensary shortly after, where Alara was sorting the morning deliveries with Lyra attached to her left side, and Soren organizing the lower shelves in a manner that would need to be redone later. "There are 3 men here," Olive said, in the tone she used for information that required immediate processing. Alara looked up. Olive said it simply and directly, the way she said everything. Silver eyes, asking questions. Alara set down the bundle she was holding. She looked at her children. Soren had found a jar of dried chamomile and was inspecting it with great seriousness. Lyra was watching Alara's face with those precise silver eyes, already reading something in her mother's expression. Alara thought about what she had said to Olive, weeks ago now. "I am not going to hide, and I am not going to go running toward anyone either." "Bring them here," she said. Olive raised one eyebrow slightly, which was her equivalent of a strong reaction. Then she went. Alara set her work aside. She tidied the front counter. She straightened her clothes. She crouched down to her children's level and said, "I need you both to stay close to me for a little while. Can you do that?" Soren, who rarely stayed close to anything voluntarily, assessed her expression and said, "Yes, Mama," with uncharacteristic promptness. Lyra simply came and stood beside her and put her small hand in Alara's hand, which was an answer complete in itself. They were standing like that, all 3, when Olive brought the scouts through the dispensary door. They were, up close, even more visibly trained than they had appeared from a distance. The one who led was a woman in her 30s with a narrow face and watchful eyes, and she stopped inside the doorway and looked at the 3 of them, and her gaze went first to the children and then held, very still. Silver. Both of them, unmistakably. The woman's composure was professional and intact, but something shifted behind her eyes, the particular shift of someone who has been looking for something for a long time and has just found it. She dropped, slowly and deliberately, to one knee. The 2 men behind her did the same. Soren stared at them with enormous eyes. "Why are they kneeling?" he whispered to Alara, at the volume that 3-year-olds consider a whisper. "Because they are showing respect," Alara said. "To us?" He looked deeply interested. "Yes," Alara said. Lyra said nothing, but her hand tightened around Alara's. The woman looked up from her kneeling position. Her voice was steady and formal and entirely direct. "We serve the household of Cale Dawnborn, Alpha King of the Northern Territories and Sovereign of the Aligned Pacts. We were sent to follow reports of silver-eyed children in the neutral territories. We found what we were looking for." She paused. "You are Alara. He told us your name. He told us to look for you." The room was very quiet. Alara felt the words land in the center of her chest, not with shock, because she had been preparing for something like this, in her quiet way, for months, but with a weight that was its own kind of gravity. "He told us to look for you. 3 years, he had been looking." "Stand up," she said, to the kneeling scouts. "Please." They stood. She looked at the woman directly. "What is your name?" "Nora," the woman said. "Nora, what exactly were you sent here to do?" "To confirm the children's identity and their well-being," Nora said, "and to bring an invitation, not a command. We were very specifically told to make that clear. The king wishes to see you. He wishes to know his children. But the choice of whether to come is entirely yours." Alara watched her steadily. Those were his words? Exactly? The exact words he used were, "If she has not forgiven me for leaving, tell her I have not forgiven myself either. But tell her the choice is hers. It always was." Something tight and long-held moved in Alara's chest. She breathed in carefully. "Do you have something in writing?" she asked. Nora reached into her coat and produced a letter, sealed with a crest she had never seen before, but knew immediately. Dark blue wax. The Dawnborn mark. She took it from Nora's hand. She turned it over. She did not open it. She just held it for a moment, and felt the solid reality of it between her fingers. "You can wait at the inn," she said to Nora. "I will have your answer by tomorrow morning." Nora nodded. "Of course." She glanced at the children once more, briefly, with an expression that broke through her professional composure just slightly. She looked like someone who had spent a long time looking for something important and had found it intact. Then she composed herself again and led the two scouts out. The dispensary was quiet. Olive had discreetly disappeared somewhere during the conversation. Soren was still watching the door the scouts had left through with the intensely analytical expression he wore when processing something new. Lyra was still holding Ilara's hand and watching her mother's face. Ilara walked to the chair behind the counter and sat down. She looked at the sealed letter in her hand. "Mama," Lyra said, in her precise, clear voice, "who was that lady?" "Someone who was sent by someone important," Ilara said. "Who sent her?" Ilara looked at her daughter. 3 years old, silver-eyed, entirely serious. She thought about what she had told Olive. They deserve to know who they are. All of it. Even the parts I am still figuring out. "Your father," she said. Lyra looked at her without blinking. Soren spun around from the door so fast he nearly lost his balance. They both stared at her. "We have a father?" Soren said, with the particular amazement of someone encountering a concept they had considered theoretical. "Yes," Ilara said. "You do." She looked at the letter in her hand, and then at her children looking back at her, and she understood that the life she had built in Ashvale, solid and good and entirely hers, was about to change shape. She did not know yet exactly what it would become. She had not read the letter. She had not answered Nora. She had not decided anything, except that she was not going to hide, and she was not going to run. She broke the seal. The handwriting was familiar to her even after 3 years. Careful and precise, not ornate. The same handwriting that had written "You are not forgotten" on a piece of paper she still carried in her coat pocket. The letter was short. 4 words. "I never stopped looking." She closed her eyes. She sat in the dispensary of the Hearthstone Inn, in the border town of Ashvale, where she had arrived 3 years ago with nothing, and she held the letter in both hands, and she let herself feel, just for a moment, everything she had been very carefully not feeling for a very long time. Then she opened her eyes. She looked at Soren and Lyra, who were both watching her with silver eyes wide. "Go put your coats on," she said. "We are going to the inn to have dinner with some people." Soren immediately began moving. Lyra kept watching her for one more second, reading her, as always, with that unnerving precision. Then she nodded once, as if something had been confirmed, and went to find her coat. Ilara folded the letter and put it in her pocket, next to the original one. 2 pieces of paper, one written 3 years ago, one written now. She stood up, she smoothed her dress, she went to find her own coat. Tomorrow morning, she would give Nora her answer. She already knew what it would be. The royal convoy moved through packed territories like weather. Not loudly, not with the aggressive display that some in the nobility favored, but with a quiet, inevitable quality that made people step aside and watch. There were no banners. The carriages were dark and well-made, but not ostentatious. The King's Guard rode in careful formation, professional and precise. But the sheer steadiness of the procession, its unhurried certainty, spoke a kind of authority that did not need decoration. Ilara sat in the second carriage, with Soren on her left and Lyra on her right, and she watched the landscape change through the window. The neutral territories fell behind them, the roads improved, the trees thickened and then thinned, and then gave way to managed farmland, the ordered fields of pack-claim territory. Soren pressed his face against the glass constantly, narrating what he saw with a running commentary that required no audience. Lyra watched the world with her hands folded in her lap, and said very little, but her silver eyes moved steadily, noting everything. Ilara had told them as much as was appropriate for 3-year-olds to hold, that their father was a very important person, that they were going to meet him, that he had been looking for them. Soren had processed this in about 45 seconds, and moved on to questions about the carriage, the horses, and whether the guards' swords were real. Lyra had been quiet for a long time, and then had asked, "Is he good?" It was exactly the question Ilara had been hoping and dreading. She had thought about it carefully before answering. "He was kind to me when I needed kindness," she said. "I think he is a good person, but you will meet him yourself, and you can decide." Lyra had nodded. That seemed sufficient. Nora rode ahead with the main escort. She had been, since Ashvale, quietly and professionally efficient, ensuring that the journey was comfortable, that the stops were well planned, that Soren and Lyra had space to move during rest breaks, rather than being confined to the carriage. Ilara noticed this, and appreciated it. On the third day of travel, the convoy crossed into Ironmore territory. Elara knew when they crossed the border. She had lived in Ironmore for 5 years, and she knew its land from its scent in the air, the particular quality of the northern forest here, the slight rise in the terrain. She straightened in her seat without entirely meaning to. Soren pulled his face from the window. "Mama, what is this place?" "A pack territory," she said. "We are passing through." The carriage rolled through the border checkpoint without stopping. The Ironmore guards at the post stepped back immediately when they saw the convoy markings. Elara saw their faces as the carriage passed, the startled recognition, the quick bowing of heads. The convoy entered Ironmore proper. Word moved faster than the horses. That was always how it was in packs. By the time the convoy reached the main village road, people were already appearing in doorways and along the path edges. Elara recognized faces. She had known these people for 5 years. She saw the baker, who had always given her the day-old bread at a reduced price. She saw the elder, Barren, standing at the edge of the path with her white hair pulled back, and an expression of something that might have been relief. She saw the families she had greeted by name every morning for 5 years, whose children she had watched grow, who had watched her quiet erosion and not known how to stop it. They looked at the convoy, and then, as the second carriage drew level, they looked through the window, and they saw her. She held their gaze. She did not smile. She did not perform anything. She simply let them see her, sitting straight in a royal carriage with her 2 silver-eyed children beside her, wearing the same quiet dignity she had worn out of their village 3 years ago on a dark night, after a ceremony she had not chosen. The elder, Barren, looked directly at Elara through the glass and pressed her lips together and nodded once, slowly. Elara nodded back. The carriage rolled on. Caden came out of the pack hall at the sound of the convoy. She saw him before he saw her. He had aged, not badly, but visibly. He stood at the top of the hall steps with his dark hair still thick, but his face more lined, his eyes carrying a heaviness that had not been there before. He was watching the convoy with the expression of a man who has been expecting something he does not want to arrive. Then he saw her. For one unguarded second, every careful surface dropped from his face, and she saw what was underneath it. Shock, and something much harder to define. Regret was in there. She thought she could see that. She was not sure if it was for her or for himself. She did not stop. The carriage did not stop. It was not scheduled to stop. The convoy moved through Ironmore without pausing, on its route to the capital. Nora had told her, quietly, the evening before, that there was business here. Pack business, royal business, the kind that came with the discovery that 2 crown heirs had been living in the neutral territories, unknown and unprotected. The formal elements of that business would be addressed in due course, at the capital, in a proper setting. Today the convoy simply moved through. Presence was enough. Visibility was enough. Elara looked at Caden's face through the window, until the carriage moved past, and the angle of the road took him out of sight. She thought about 5 years. She thought about the garden with the lavender and the sage. She thought about the letter she had received at sunrise, and the ceremony, and the bone-deep feeling of the bond breaking. She thought about the specific words he had said. "I did what was necessary for the pack." She thought about Soren and Lyra. She thought about the 12 days in a wildlands cabin. She thought about the letter in her coat pocket. 4 words in careful handwriting. She did not feel triumphant. That was what surprised her. She had imagined, sometimes, in her private hours, what it would feel like to pass through Ironmore on the other side of everything. She had thought it would feel like a victory, but it did not feel like that. It felt more like something being set down. The weight of those 5 years, the way she had carried them, the specific burden of other people's decisions about her worth. The carriage moved through Ironmore and out the other side, and the weight was not gone, but it had changed shape. It was something she was choosing to set down, rather than something being taken from her. Beside her, Soren said, "Who was that man?" She looked at her son. "Someone I knew a long time ago," she said. "He looked sad," Soren said. Elara looked out the window at the forest road ahead. "Yes," she said. "I think he is." "Why?" She thought about this. She thought about how to answer it truthfully and appropriately for a 3-year-old who was watching her with clear, attentive eyes. "Sometimes people make choices," she said, "and then they have to live with what those choices cost them. That is what makes them sad." Soren considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything that interested him. Then he nodded and turned back to the window. Lyra had been watching her mother's face through the whole exchange, as she always did. Now she reached out and put her small hand on Alara's arm, not saying anything, just placing her hand there. Alara covered it with her own. The forest moved past the window. The road opened ahead. The convoy moved steadily toward the capital, unhurried and certain, and Alara sat between her children and felt the territory of her past fall away behind her, like the towns and the tree line and the gray morning sky. She was not going back. She was not going back to Ironmore, not going back to the life she had spent 5 years trying to make work, not going back to the person she had been when she arrived there at 19, so young and so eager to do everything right for people who had already decided what she was worth. She was going forward. She always had been. Even when she was walking through the wildlands in the dark with a broken fire kit and an ankle that screamed at every step, she had been going forward. Even when she had been sitting on the floor of Petra's house with her hands flat on her stomach and her world rearranged around her completely, she had pulled herself upright and walked back down the hill and gone to work. Even in the hardest nights in Ashvale, when the children were both crying and she was exhausted and the loneliness was sharp, she had gotten through those nights and faced the morning. Forward. Always forward. The capital was 3 more days. She settled back in her seat, her daughter's hand under hers, her son narrating the landscape beside her, and she faced the road ahead with clear eyes and a steady heart. The inquiry took 4 weeks to assemble and 2 days to conduct. Alara had not fully understood, until she arrived at the capital, what it meant to be in the center of the world, rather than on its edge. Ashvale had been a place where she existed without performance, a small, quiet life that was hers because she had built it herself. The capital of the Dawnborn territory was something else entirely. Large, ordered, beautiful, in a way that was clearly the product of centuries of intention. Wide stone streets, buildings that had been there long enough to develop weight and authority simply from standing. Pack representatives from across the territories moving through the halls and courtyards with the specific posture of people who understood that visibility here was a form of currency. She had been given rooms in the east wing of the main residence, 3 connecting rooms that were warm and well lit, and far larger than anything she was used to. She had been given a household staff, 2 women named Agnes and Petra, which caused a moment of private amusement since she already associated that name with someone who examined people with great precision. The staff were respectful and competent, and did not ask questions, which was exactly what she needed. Soren had immediately begun an assessment of the entire wing, including closets and ceiling heights, and the acoustics of the long corridor, which he tested by running the length of it shouting, until Alara gently redirected him. Lyra had walked slowly through all 3 rooms, pressing her palms against the walls in her habitual way, and then declared them good, which Alara took as genuine approval. She had not seen Kale. This was, she understood, the correct protocol. There were formalities to be observed, a proper order to things that the capital required even of its king. But she felt his presence in the building, in a way she could not have explained logically, and did not examine too carefully. Something in the air had a different quality here than it had anywhere else she had been, as if the territory itself registered his presence and oriented around it. She prepared carefully for the inquiry. Nora provided her with an advisor, a quiet, sharp-minded man named Owen, who walked her through the process with patience and thoroughness. The inquiry was a formal legal proceeding of the highest level, convened by the Royal Council to investigate a matter that touched both pack law and crown law. The evidence was the correspondence found in the late healer Drew's belongings, the letters between Drew and Alpha Vale outlining the arrangement for a false diagnosis. Additional witnesses had been identified, pack members who had seen relevant events or who could speak to the circumstances. Alara was not required to testify unless she chose to. Owen made this clear more than once. But she had chosen to. She had thought about it carefully, and she had decided that if there was a proceeding in which the truth of what had been done to her was going to be formally established, she wanted to be present and she wanted to speak. She sat in the inquiry chamber on the second morning. The room was large and stone-floored, with high windows that let in a pale light. The council was assembled along one side, 5 men and women in formal dress, the highest legal authority in the aligned territories. Pack representatives from Ironmore and Vale territory sat on one side. Elara sat at the center of the room on a single chair, her hands in her lap, her posture careful. She did not look at Caden, who sat with the Ironmore representatives in a row to her left. She looked at the council. She answered every question honestly and directly. She described the diagnosis, the years that followed, the ceremony, the bond breaking, the night she had walked into the wildlands. She spoke without excess and without performance. She did not accuse anyone beyond what the evidence already showed, because the evidence already showed enough. When she finished, one of the council members, a silver-haired woman named Judge Lorne, asked her a question that was not strictly part of the legal process. "In your own words," Judge Lorne said, "what would you like to see come from this proceeding?" Elara thought about it genuinely, not performing consideration, but actually considering. Then she said, "I would like the record to reflect what was true. That is all. I was told for years that I was not enough. I would like it to be formally established that this was a lie, not a fact. My children deserve to know that their mother was never broken. She was lied to." The room was quiet. Then she added, "Whatever consequences follow from the evidence are for the council to determine. I am not here for consequences. I am here for the record." Judge Lorne looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and wrote something down. The findings came the following afternoon. Alpha Vale's title was formally stripped. The late healer Drew's involvement was entered into the record, his professional standing posthumously revoked. The bribery arrangement was confirmed and documented. The consequences for Ironmore were addressed separately, in terms of the broken pact covenant, the sacred laws of mating that Caden had violated, knowingly or unknowingly. The council was careful and specific. Caden had not known the diagnosis was false. This was accepted, but he had been the authority. He had been the alpha. He had chosen, when pressure came, to accept a finding that suited the outcome he wanted. That was not exoneration. Ironmore was placed under royal regency, pending structural review. Caden's authority was suspended. He was not stripped of his name or his bloodline, but the weight of what his choices had set in motion was placed, formally, in the record beside his name. Seraphine Vale, who had known nothing, was released from all formal obligations without penalty. Elara was in the East Wing when Owen came to tell her the findings. She listened. She thanked him. After he left, she sat in the window seat of the main room, where Lyra was asleep in the afternoon light, and Soren was quietly and very seriously constructing something architectural out of blocks that Agnes had found for him. The record had been corrected. She had not known, entirely, how much she had needed that until she felt the weight lift. Not the practical weight, not the daily heaviness of survival. Something deeper than that. The story that had been told about her, the story she had sometimes, in her worst hours, almost started to believe herself, that she was the problem, that she had been inadequate, that the fault lay in her. It had never been true. The record now said so. She looked at her children. Soren placed one block carefully on another and frowned at the result with deep concentration. Lyra breathed in the afternoon light, her silver lashes dark on her cheek. She would tell them everything when they were old enough. She would tell them exactly what had happened, and exactly how she had survived it, and exactly what had been true and what had been a lie. She would not soften it unnecessarily. They deserved the whole of it. For now, they were asleep and building and breathing. It was enough. She met Cale in the East Garden on a clear morning, 5 days after the inquiry. It had been arranged by Nora, who had a gift for organizing difficult things with a minimum of ceremony. Elara had agreed to the time and the place, and had spent the previous evening not thinking about it, which had meant thinking about it constantly. She had slept poorly, and woken early, and made her own tea in the kitchen, that the staff had shown her how to use, and she had sat in the window for a long time, watching the sky go from dark to gray to pale gold. Agnes had taken the children for a morning walk in the main gardens. Elara had thanked her, and then stood in the empty rooms for a moment, listening to the silence, remembering that she had once known how to be alone, without it feeling like abandonment. She walked out to the East Garden at the appointed time. He was already there. He was standing at the edge of the garden path with his back to her, looking out at the formal beds of winter bare plants, and she stopped for a moment when she first saw him. 3 years was long enough to wonder if memory had distorted things, had made the details of a person too significant because of the emotions attached to them. She had wondered, sometimes, if she had built him into something larger than the reality. He was exactly as she remembered. Tall, still, the quality of being present in a space without taking it over, the dark coat, and when he heard her step on the gravel and turned, the silver eyes, exactly the color she had carried in her memory, and exactly the color she saw every morning in her children's faces. They looked at each other across the garden path. She had prepared things to say. She had thought carefully about what she wanted to communicate, what questions she needed answered, what she required from this conversation, to feel that it was real and not a performance. She had the words ready. She said none of them. What she said was, "They are named Soren and Lyra." Something moved through his face. Not the controlled, professional composure that she had seen on him in public contexts, in the formal corridors of the residence. This was the face from the cabin, the one that did not perform anything. And in that face, when she said their names, was something that broke through every professional layer and showed her what was underneath. "Tell me about them," he said. So she did. She stood in the east garden on a cold, clear morning, and she told him about his children, Soren's single-mindedness and his mechanical curiosity, and his enormous laugh, Lyra's precision and her watchfulness, and the way she pressed her palms against surfaces she found interesting. She told him about the first time they had walked, and the things they were afraid of, and their favorite foods, and the way they were completely different from each other, and completely a unit. She told him about the silver eyes appearing in the moment they opened them for the first time, the silence that had fallen in the room, Olive going still by the door. He listened the way he had always listened, with his complete and undivided attention, with that quality of someone who has put everything else aside. When she finished, he said, "I owe you an explanation." "Yes," she said. "You do," he told her. He told her who he was, the full reality of it, the weight of the title, and what it required. He told her about the night he had found her on the frozen riverbank, and what had already been between them, from the first moment. He told her about the obligation that had called him away from the cabin, a territorial crisis in the eastern Pax that had required his immediate physical presence, a situation that could not wait and could not be delegated. He told her that he had left the letter to Olive before he left, and had believed she would find Alara, and that when Olive had eventually told him that Alara had left Ashvale before the letter could be delivered, he had started looking. "It took longer than it should have," he said. "Not because we were not looking, because you were not in any pack system. You had made yourself effectively invisible, which was the right thing to do, and made the search significantly harder." "I was not trying to hide from you specifically," she said. "I was trying to build something safe for them." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry I left the way I did. I could not take you with me. Not then. Not in the middle of a territorial crisis, with no established context for who you were and what your safety would require. But I should have been clearer. I should have left more." She looked at him steadily. The 4 words were sufficient, she said. Eventually. Something in his expression shifted. She thought, for the first time since arriving at the capital, that she could feel the precise shape of the thing between them. 3 years of distance and 12 days of proximity, and everything in between. The bond that had grown in that cabin was not gone. It had not faded. It had been waiting, the way certain things wait when they are real, without diminishing. "I have things to say," she said, "and I am going to say them." "I know," he said. "I spent 5 years being told I was not enough. I was lied to, and manipulated, and cast out. And I walked through the wildlands alone, and built a life from nothing. I raised your children without help or support, because I did not know how to ask for it, and did not know you were looking. I am not angry about all of it, because some of it made me into the person standing in front of you right now, and I believe in that person. But I am not going to be treated as less than what I am by anyone, ever again, including you, including this house, including anyone in this territory. That is not negotiable," she finished. Cale looked at her for a long moment. His silver eyes were direct and clear. "No," he said. "It is not. Nor should it be." She breathed in. Some of the tension she had been holding since arriving at the capital released. "I would like to meet them," he said. "Yes," she said. "Today, if you can." "I can." She looked at him for a moment more. 3 years and 12 days and 4 words and 2 children. The weight of what they had not had time to build yet. and the weight of what was already there, unasked for and undeniable. "Come on then," she said. She turned and walked back toward the east wing. After a brief moment, she heard his footsteps on the gravel, steady and even, following her. He had always been that. Steady, even, following when it was the right thing to follow. She did not reach for his hand. That was not where they were yet. But she walked beside him through the garden, and in through the east wing door, and down the corridor, toward the rooms where Agnes would be returning with her children, and she felt the shape of the future she was walking into, and it was not what she had imagined at 19, and it was not what she had survived in Ironmore, and it was not what she had built in Ashvale. It was its own thing. It required its own building. She was ready to build. Soren saw Cale first, because Soren always saw everything first. He came through the corridor door with his coat still on, and his boots leaving prints, and stopped dead when he saw the tall man standing in the main room. He looked at Cale, with the focused, assessing gaze he brought to everything interesting. Then he looked at his mother, then back at Cale. "Your eyes are the same as ours," he said. Cale looked at him. Whatever he was feeling, whatever this moment cost him to stand in, his face was warm, completely warm. She had not seen quite that expression on him before. "Yes," he said. Soren processed this for about 3 seconds. "Mama said you are our father." "Yes," Cale said. Another second of processing. "Do you know how to fix gate latches?" Soren asked. Alara pressed her hand over her mouth. Cale looked briefly at her, with something in his expression that she recognized only as genuine feeling. Then he looked back at Soren. "Tell me about the gate." Soren began immediately. He was still talking when Lyra came through the door, stopped, and looked at Cale with her silver eyes, and her characteristic still precision. Cale looked back at her. He crouched down to her level, slowly and carefully. Lyra studied him for a very long moment, with the seriousness she brought to everything important. Then she walked over and put her small hand flat on his cheek, the way she pressed her palms against surfaces she found significant. He was absolutely still under her hand. He did not speak. After a moment, Lyra took her hand away and looked at Alara. "He is good," she said simply. Alara's throat tightened. She nodded. "Yes," she said. "I think he is." 1 year. That was how long it had been since the carriage had brought them through the Capitol gates, since the East Garden, since Lyra had pressed her small hand against Cale's cheek and delivered her verdict. 1 year was not very long in the life of an institution. It was not very long in the history of a royal house, or a pack system, or a set of territorial alliances that had taken generations to construct. But 1 year was enough time for Alara to learn the shape of the life she had walked into, its rhythms, and its weight, and its particular demands. It was enough time to know what it had cost her, and what it had given her, and to hold both of those things clearly at once. Soren was 4 now, and had developed a workshop in a disused storeroom that the household staff had surrendered to him, reportedly without great resistance, since his projects had become both more ambitious and more mobile. He had fixed the gate latch at his mother's specific request, incorrectly, and then correctly, on the 3rd attempt, and Cale had sat with him through all 3 versions, with a patience and focus that had settled something in Alara that she had not known was still unsettled. He was a father, not performing it, not demonstrating it for an audience, just present, the way he was present in everything, completely, and without reservation, learning his son the way his son was learning the world. Lyra was 4, and had decided, at some point in the autumn, that she wanted to learn to read. Not from a basic primer, from the real books in the East Library. The librarian had come to Alara with an expression that mixed amusement and genuine amazement, and said that Lyra had requested access to the genealogical texts, specifically, the ones relating to pack bloodlines. Alara had agreed immediately. She was not going to discourage that. Lyra now went to the library 3 mornings a week, with a focus and seriousness that the librarian described as unprecedented in a child of 4, and frankly, in a number of adults. The territory had adjusted to them. This had not been instant. There had been pack lords who had required careful formal conversations about precedent and succession, and the specific legal status of children born in the neutral territories, to an unmated alpha king. Owen had handled much of this with his sharp, quiet competence, and Nora had handled the rest with her professional thoroughness, and Cale had held the formal meetings with the particular authority that he carried in public spaces. the kind that did not raise its voice and did not need to. Ilara had attended several of these meetings. She had been introduced, formally and officially, as the Alpha King's true mate and the mother of the crown heirs. The first time this had happened, she had sat in the formal chair in the council chamber, in the clothes that Agnes had helped her choose, and she had looked out at the assembled pack representatives with completely clear eyes. She had thought, for a second, of 19-year-old Ilara arriving at Ironmore, so eager and so frightened. She had wanted, very briefly and without self-indulgence, to tell that girl something. That it was going to be very hard and very painful, and that she was going to be cast out and walk through the dark alone, and that she was going to survive all of it and come out the other side, carrying two small people, with silver eyes, and a garden's worth of patience, and the ability to stand in a formal chamber, in front of a room full of people, who were assessing her, and feel entirely, completely, herself. She had said nothing, because there was no 19-year-old Ilara to say it to. There was only this Ilara, the one who had been made by all of it. She had sat in the formal chair, and looked at the council with clear eyes, and let them take her measure, and she had felt, quietly and with great certainty, that whatever measure they took was accurate. Kale and Ilara had rebuilt slowly. That was the only honest word for it. They had rebuilt carefully, in the way that you rebuild something important, with attention and patience and the understanding that rushing produced weak foundations. They had talked, really talked, in the evenings when the children were asleep, sitting across from each other in the main room with the fire going, and they had said the difficult things alongside the easy ones, and they had learned each other not as they had been in 12 days in a cabin, but as they actually were, in full, in the ordinary daily life that reveals a person more completely than any crisis. She had learned that he was not good at rest, that he had spent so long carrying the weight of leadership that stillness felt uncomfortable to him, and he had been working on this, apparently, for years before she arrived. She had learned that he could be, occasionally, too certain of his own read on a situation, and that when this happened, the best approach was a direct question, rather than an argument, because arguments made him defensive, but direct questions made him actually reconsider. She had learned that he found their children completely extraordinary in the way that parents do, but also in a way that was specific to Kale, a quality of attention he brought to them, that she recognized as genuine wonder, the wonder of someone who had not expected to be given something this real. He had learned her too. He knew that she needed the mornings to herself, the quiet time before everyone else woke up, and he had simply accommodated this without making it a discussion. He had learned that she was more afraid of disappointing people than she usually showed, and that she covered this with competence, and that sometimes what she needed was not a solution to a problem, but simply someone to sit with her while she held it. He had learned that she was funnier than she appeared, with a dry precision to her humor that he found, apparently, consistently surprising even after a year. They had not rushed. The bond between them had not needed rushing. It was there the way it had always been there, from that first evening in the cabin, when she had set down her knife and accepted his help, the undeniable quality of it, the specific fit of two people who are simply correct for each other, in a way that transcends circumstance. On the first day of the new year, Kale had asked to speak to her in the East Garden again. She had walked out to find him standing in the same place, at the edge of the formal beds, and she had thought, with a private affection, that he had no idea how obvious he was sometimes, for someone who believed himself inscrutable. He had said formal words, pack words, mate bond words, the kind of language that carried legal and ceremonial weight. He had said them looking at her directly with his silver eyes, not performing anything, and then he had said, more simply, "I would very much like you to choose me, if you want to, and if you do not, nothing between us changes, and the children are exactly who they are regardless." She had looked at him for a long moment. She had thought of 5 years in Ironmore, and 12 days in a cabin, and 3 years in Ashvale, and 1 year in this Capitol building something new from the ground up, the same way she had always built things, slowly and correctly, with the right materials. "I choose you," she said. It was that simple. After all of it, it was that simple. The formal ceremony was held 2 weeks later, not a large public event, because neither of them wanted large and public. A smaller gathering in the Great Hall, pack representatives, and the Royal Council, and a few people who mattered. Olive had come from Ashvale, broad and white-haired, with the expression of someone attending an event they had privately predicted for some time. Clara had come, with her 3 children who had immediately formed an alliance with Soren and caused a minor incident involving the formal flower arrangements that everyone agreed to attribute to the wind. Marin, the old pack elder from Ironmoor, was there. She had asked, through Owen, if she might attend. Ilara had said yes. Marin had said nothing, except Ilara's name, when they stood briefly face to face. And she had said it in the way you say the name of someone you owe an apology, that is too large to fit into a sentence. Soren wore his best clothes, and spent most of the ceremony trying to identify what the chandelier was made of, which Lyra periodically reported to him in a whisper, as if they were conducting an investigation. Lyra herself wore a small blue sash that matched Ilara's dress, and stood with a seriousness that made several of the attending pack lords visibly affected. Ilara stood beside Kale in the great hall and said the words, and felt the mate bond form, not like a chain, and not like a loss, but like something clicking into place, that had been waiting to click into place for a very long time. And then it was done. Not the end of something. The beginning of a different kind of something, the one she had been walking toward without knowing it, through the dark forest, and the frozen wildlands, and the border town, and the east wing, and the garden, and all the long careful work of learning who she was when no one was telling her. She had been called Barren. She had been cast out of a pack that called itself her home. She had been walked away from, in a frozen river camp, by a man who had not even left his name. She had been alone in the wildlands, and alone in Ashvale, and she had raised 2 children by herself for 3 years, with nothing but her own strength, and the patience of people she had come to call friends. She stood in the great hall of the Dawnborn seat with her mate beside her, and her children a few feet away. Soren now holding Lyra's hand, because Lyra had looked briefly uncertain during the ceremony, and Soren had noticed and responded with a quiet, unannounced steadiness that his mother would think about for years. Pack lord after pack lord came forward to offer formal acknowledgement. The crown heirs were officially presented. The council recorded everything. The world outside the hall, the broad and complicated world of pack politics and territorial alliances and succession and law, rearranged itself around the new reality that this ceremony had made official. Ilara stood at the center of it and felt neither small nor overwhelmed. She felt, clearly and without doubt, exactly like herself. That was the thing no one had been able to take from her, not even in the worst of it, not even when she had been closest to believing their version of her own story. She had stayed herself, smaller sometimes, worn thinner sometimes, frightened sometimes, but herself, always. They had called her barren. They had called her worth nothing. They had cast her into the dark and closed the door. She had walked through that dark, and found a cabin, and found a stranger with silver eyes, and found a border town, and found a dispensary, and found herself, really found herself, perhaps for the first time, in the long quiet of Ashvale's winters, and the daily work of raising 2 people from nothing, into someone. She had not come back to prove anything. She had said that to Olive, once, and she meant it. Proof was for people who needed others to validate what they already knew. She did not need that. What she had needed was for the record to be corrected, for her children to know the truth of their origins, for herself to stand in a room and be exactly who she was without apology. She had all of that. Soren pulled his hand from Lyra's and came to stand beside Ilara, leaning against her left side, and Lyra came to her right, and Kale stood steady at her side, and the great hall was full of voices and light, and somewhere outside the tall windows the capital was going about its morning, and the sun was fully up, and the world was turning on its usual axis, indifferent to the ceremonies of small human lives. But inside the hall, at the center of it, something had been completed. Not a fairy story, not a vindication, not a triumph that canceled what had come before. Life did not work like that, and Ilara was too honest a person to pretend otherwise. There would be difficult things ahead. There would be politics and challenges, and days where nothing was simple. There would be work, always work, the kind that does not end. But she had learned something in the 5 years of Ironmoor, and the 12 days of the Wildlands, and the 3 years of Ashvale, and the 1 year of this capital, something she intended to teach her children, as soon as they were old enough to carry it. The work does not end. That is the truth. The work of being who you are, in a world that will sometimes try to tell you who you are not, never fully ends. But you do not have to do it without ground beneath you. She pressed her hand gently against the top of Lyra's head and felt her daughter lean in. She felt Soren's warmth against her left side. She felt Kale, still and steady at her right. Ground. She had found it. She had built it. She had carried it through everything, and she had arrived here with it intact. That, she thought, was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.